I told you, I think you're about to make off without payment, and if I don't arrest you, then you will make off without payment.
The sergeant's opening accusation of bilking simply doesn't stand up. Under the Theft Act 1978, making off without payment requires two key elements: actually leaving the premises and intending to avoid payment. The auditor was still on site, sitting in his car and actively offering to pay. When the auditor produces a $100 Royal Mint coin, the sergeant makes matters worse by claiming it depends on what the store will accept. That is not how the law operates. Once fuel has been dispensed, a debt exists, and offering legal tender lawfully discharges that debt. A cashier's personal preference or lack of knowledge cannot override statute. By siding with Tesco, rather than the law, the sergeant demonstrated that he had no understanding of the very basics of legal tender.
But this is different because...
No, it's not different.
No,
you have offered a form of payment that...
But this is different because, no, it's not different. You have offered a form of payment that they say they will not accept. The principle is exactly the same. Well, if you arrest me, this is where the sergeant's credibility completely collapses. When the auditor correctly points out that the EB coin carries a face value of $100, the sergeant flatly denies it, describing it as merely a commemorative coin. That is not how the law works. A coin struck by the Royal Mint with an assigned face value is legal tender, regardless of whether it is commemorative or in general circulation. Its status comes from statute, not from the cashier's preference or the officer's opinion. By claiming the coin does not carry its face value, the sergeant displayed a total lack of understanding of currency law. Commemorative or not, the 100 coin is backed by the Crown and HM Treasury, meaning it must be accepted for the payment of a debt.
Do you want to check to make sure it's not an unlawful arrest?
Another unit, please.
I'm not.
The sergeant openly admits he has dealt with this exact situation before, yet he cannot even explain what the outcome was. That alone shows he is not learning from experience. He is simply repeating the same heavy-handed response without reflection. What makes matters worse is his refusal to even check. When pressed, he shrugs it off, saying he does not have time to look into the result. Yet seconds later, he boasts that he does have time to make an arrest and complete all the paperwork that follows. That is not policing. That is ego. Arrest should always be a last resort, supported by clear facts. Here, the facts were right in front of him. The auditor had not left the premises, had offered payment, and was holding lawful currency.
I am only here to enforce the law. I'm not here to decide.
Reference as to what type of note or coin they accept. That's ridiculous.
The sergeant trying to portray this as the auditor attempting to pull a fast one is frankly laughable. A fast one is when someone slips away without paying, not when they remain in plain sight offering legal tender directly to the cashier. The entire accusation collapses the moment you remember the auditor never left the forecourt, never concealed his intentions, and openly presented a $100 coin issued by the Royal Mint. When the sergeant presses further, asking why he does not simply pay another way, the auditor's response cuts straight to the heart of the matter. It is about principle. He should not have to change his method simply because the shop or the police dislike it. The law recognizes that coin as valid currency. If retailers can refuse it and the police support them with threats of arrest, then suddenly it is no longer the law determining what counts as money. It becomes a matter of individual preference.
That's not your job, is it, to say what type of coin that...
Perfectly when he told the sergeant, "You cannot be prosecuted for non-payment if you have already offered legal tender." That is the entire purpose of legal tender. Once it is offered, the debt is discharged whether the retailer likes it or not. The offense of making off without payment only applies when someone leaves without paying and intends to avoid payment. Altogether, his comparison with Scottish banknotes is spot on. Technically, they are not legal tender in England, yet retailers across the country accept them every single day without issue. So how can Tesco happily accept Scottish notes but reject an official UK $100 coin that is legal tender? It exposes the absurdity of the sergeant's position. The problem was never the auditor's method of payment. It was the store's inconsistency, reinforced by poor policing.
There was an invitation to take the fuel, and I've taken the fuel.
Technology is devastating because it reduces the issue to basic common sense. Once you have received the goods, the business cannot suddenly decide which lawful forms of payment it will accept. A restaurant may refuse a $50 note before providing service, but not after the meal has been served and a debt exists. The same principle applies at the petrol station. The fuel had already been supplied, and the auditor offered legal tender. That should end the matter. The sergeant's failure to recognize this was not a minor oversight. It was a complete collapse of basic legal understanding. Legal tender exists so that once it is offered, the debt is discharged in law, full stop. By siding with Tesco's preference over statute, he transformed a simple civil issue into a criminal allegation that never actually existed.
Right, so these coins are made by the Royal Mint.
Yep, and they're on legal tender.
And they are
No
legal
argument
tender.
there.
By quoting the Bank of England, stating that shopkeepers are not legally obliged to accept legal tender. On the surface, that statement is true. The Bank of England itself confirms that retailers can decide which payment methods they accept. However, what the sergeant completely fails to grasp is the context. That rule only applies at the point of sale before goods are supplied. Once goods have been provided, a debt exists, and legal tender discharges that debt, whether the retailer likes it or not. That is precisely the distinction the auditor correctly identified. Paying for fuel is not the same as attempting to buy an item from a shelf where the shop can refuse coins or notes in advance. The fuel was already in the tank, meaning the transaction had moved beyond choice. At that stage, the only question is whether the customer offers valid legal tender to settle the debt.